Recovery webinar. We'll just wait for a few more people to join and then we'll get started. If you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're from and your interest in Commons, that would be fantastic. And during the webinar, please feel free to add any questions to the Q&A tab. There's an option in there to upvote questions so that you can ensure that the areas of interest that you're interested in are answered by our panelists at the end of the webinar. Susie, would you mind starting the poll? And then we can find out who's with us. We've had an incredible number of people sign up to this webinar. Well over 200 people have signed up. I'm guessing quite a few will be on holiday, so we'll I'm sure they'll catch up on YouTube. And if you'd like to catch up on the webinar at a later date, you're more than welcome to. It will be on our website. So while you're answering those questions, I will get started. We've got a really great webinar program. I'm just seeing who's joining. Susie, would you mind starting the PowerPoint, or I can share mine? Okay, so this is the final webinar for our landscape recovery test and trial that's been funded by DEFRA. Over the past 18 months, we've been looking at lowland commons and specifically looking at the Malvern Hills and the New Forest. Got a few more people joining the poll. We'll give it just another couple of minutes before I carry on. It's slowing down on the poll. Couple more minutes. While we're waiting, I will share the what we're doing this evening. So after a short introduction from me, we're going to have an update from Julia Aglionby, who's our Chief Executive Officer. She's going to share an update on elms and the different schemes. We have Josie Edwards from Michelmores looking at governance options, and we have Joe Leaper, who's our project officer in the Malvern Hills. He'll be talking with Matt from the Castle Morton Commoners Association, and they'll be looking at the options for delivering multiple outcomes on commons at landscape scale in the Malvern Hills. And then we'll be talking with Andy Perry Norton from the New Forest and Matt in conversation, thinking about the options going forward. So we've got our results from the poll. We've got 47% of attendees are farmers, which is fantastic. We've got land agents, public sector employees, environmental NGOs, 13%, which is nice amount, and 11% of farm advisors, and 6% are common land owners, which is brilliant. So at the end of the webinar, we will have a Q&A. So a little reflection from me. In 2019, the Foundation for Common Land produced a leaflet entitled Common Land and Commoning in England. iconic people delivering iconic places. The principles, supported by many key organisations, remain of paramount importance in developing policy to support the delivery of public goods on common land. Now, whilst this document is quite old, I think it's important to realise that some things haven't changed and these still remain critical. I keep returning to these statistics, which are extraordinary. That tiny percentage of England that is commons delivers so much in terms of public access, in terms of our heritage, in terms of our wildlife, our biodiversity. And if we get it wrong on commons, then we get it wrong on 21% of all SSSIs. So whilst commons are very small, they actually represent such an important part of our farming landscape. For the past 18 months, we've been exploring how landscape scale schemes could work on common land, with a particular focus on the lowland commons of the Malvern Hills Aglionby and the New Forest National Park. You can catch up with previous webinars on our website. We've also updated our common land toolkit to include the latest updates on elm schemes on common land and have added resources linked to governance, which you will learn more about later in the webinar. Whilst DEFRA have updated their guidance on the landscape recovery pilots, many questions remain around the use of private finance on SSSIs and conservation covenants on commons. As the test and trial has progressed, the importance of robust, inclusive governance alongside clear scheme rules which are followed has come to the fore. Without these, future schemes on commons cannot deliver more for people and nature. Commons are very complex landscapes, both socio-economically and ecologically complex, and often differ significantly from one another. Repeatedly, we hear that the schemes are necessary on commons, but what is what that really means? And because of the historic schemes, HLS, previous CS schemes, commons are quite wedded to the schemes of the past, and it's quite difficult to see schemes in a new light. On a personal level, as New Forest commoners, my husband Robert, now also a verderer, and I have hosted many farm visits and walked across the forest with the likes of Julian Glover, Lord Benyon, Sean McGeever. Julian Glover even jumped on a horse and went for a ride across the forest. With each and every one, we discussed the future of the forest and how government could support the delivery of public goods in the New Forest. Each and every one has said that elms should support the work commoners, the National Park Authority and the verderists have carried out through the HLS scheme. Their words at the time gave us hope, yet years down the line, it feels as though we know no more now about the schemes than we did then. The biggest challenge for the test and trial has been the conflict between the academic study for the potential of landscape recovery and the very real, fast-moving challenges on the ground. There has been great uncertainty about HLS rollovers. Commoners are finding it increasingly challenging to balance the books with decreasing BPS payments and little or no options to access the new funding schemes. Often due to land tenure, so many commoners have informal tenancies or short-term tenancies. Government organisations are also under significant financial pressures, and often their first priority is safeguarding staff jobs. There is little room for thoughts about the future when the present feels so unstable. The very slow process of developing elm does come with risks for common land. Without a clear path set out, both farmers and land managers will make decisions about land and stock management, which may put at risk the gains earned through previous schemes. So I'm going to pass over now to Julia, who will update us on the where we are with Elm and the schemes available at the moment.
Thank you very much, Lyndsey, and good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to have you with us this evening. And I just thought I'd do a quick run through with some sort of current policy updates. Today, we're particularly focusing on lowland commons. So that's going to be the area I'm going to focus on, but there obviously are there are upland developments going on as well. But the work around landscape recovery is fairly generic and will be So yes, so we're particularly looking at policy updates. The sort of specific work from the test and trials is going to be, we've got Josie from Michelmores, and Joe's going to be looking at the outcomes on the commons that we've been studying. But today I just thought I'd particularly go through options available. And this, when we started this test and trial, we very much thought we would be looking at landscape recovery scheme, but because of the uncertainties and because of the feedback we were getting, we very much decided to be sort of scheme neutral. What we're interested in is landscape scale delivery. So public good outcomes at a landscape scale, and DEFRA's used sort of above 500 hectares for that. But there are a range of schemes that you can use on your commons. So we have the sustainable farming incentive, and just last month we had announcement from DEFRA about that, and I'll say a little bit more about the moment. Countryside stewardship, which a lot of people in already, and if you're currently in a higher level stewardship, you may want to look at countryside stewardship as an alternative, because there are new options coming in the whole time. And then the third tier is landscape recovery. I'm just going back to the countryside stewardship. In our previous webinars, we would talk about local nature recovery. The local nature recovery is no longer happening. DEFRA are sticking with countryside stewardship. So the good news is that from August 2023, lowland commons will be able to apply for sustainable farming incentive through the low input grassland standard. This is at £151 a hectare. Plus, if you're a common with more than 2 beneficiaries, 2 people active on the common, you will have an additional £6.15 per hectare. So that might be the owner and a commoner, or it might be it might be several commoners and an owner, or maybe if it's an absentee, if the owner isn't involved, it may just be commoners. It may be tenants as well. So there's a range of parties that can be involved. And in order to get to apply as a common, you need to have a legally enforceable agreement, and you need to notify all legal interests so that people have an opportunity to participate, and you need to make sure you have management control. So that's the low input grassland standard. Now you need to check the eligibility of your particular type of land, whether it meets the criteria, but we would hope many commons do that. If you're already in a high level stewardship scheme, it might be that this would be double counting and it may not be available, but it depends what options you are in at the moment. So moving on to countryside stewardship scheme. As many of you will know, there's mid-tier and higher tier. There's been quite a lot of controversy around the availability of higher tier countryside stewardship due to pressures on staffing. But at the moment, commons all have to enter into higher tier. You can't be in a mid-tier scheme. So it's always sensible to look quite far in advance and to make sure that you've got all the I's dotted and T's crossed. For instance, one common that we were working with, and admittedly it was an upland common, but they had to do quite a lot of restoration work. It could apply to a lowland common too. They found that they were rejected this year on the basis that they didn't have a bank account with £350,000 in it. And they weren't considered to be business ready until they had a bank account with £350,000 in, because there were large scale restoration works to undertake. So it's really important to make sure that you can demonstrate you've got the the ability to undertake the works you're proposing. There are options to do this through working with, in other commons have worked with wildlife trusts and woodland trusts and other organisations who can help with the cash flow. But there are a number of these trip hazards available. We continue to work with RPA and with DEFRA to say that this is a slightly bonkers arrangement, because lots of people want to do good things for the environment, good things for nature recovery, good things for climate, and the cash flow is a big barrier to that. So we hope that will change in the future. It is really important that if you're applying for countryside stewardship, that you must comply with the Common Land and Shared Grazing Supplement. This isn't an optional extra. I've heard one land agent say to me that they just thought that it was a bit inconvenient to have to deal with the Common Land and Shared Grazing Supplements. They weren't going to, for instance, bother to notify all the commoners. That this isn't an optional extra, it's mandatory. Really important you go through those steps, and we provide guidance on our website as well about how to do that and tools to help you with that. So that's the area around countryside stewardship. Countryside stewardship will be continuing in the future, but we're also expecting there to be perhaps a bit of a blurring with more options going into SFI, but the autumn may reveal more. I should add with all these slides, I hope you notice the health warning that DEFRA policy and scheme rules are subject to change. So we, things can change. For instance, we know there's been a pause in SFI. We had thought, so that it's really important to check on gov.uk and to find out what the current position is, because things can change unexpectedly and often we don't know in advance. So moving on to landscape recovery. So landscape recovery is for scheme agreements which are over 500 hectares in size. There was an upper limit, but there isn't now. One of the areas to consider is that what public bodies can apply, but only in collaboration with private land managers, and so with landowners or tenants, or in this case with commoners as well. It's not completely clear who is a public body, and we have been taking advice from a barrister from a silk, and we're looking at, for instance, is the Malvern Hills Trust a public body? Are the New Forest Verderers a public body? The area is still fairly grey, and the list on the DEFRA website isn't all inclusive. So it's good to ask the questions in specific instance, but we hope to be offering more guidance in the next few weeks and months on that. The other interesting thing is that if you are if you're the owner, for instance, of a common as a public body, you may want to partner with a non-governmental organisation, a private company, an agent, or any other third party can apply a run for a landscape recovery project on behalf of other managers. So you can enter into partnership arrangements if the particular structure is, your structure is causing difficulties. And Josie will say more about special purpose vehicles in a moment. So the landscape recovery falls into two parts. So you have a development phase, which is for up to 2 years, and this is fully funded by DEFRA. This is competitive to get into this, and currently there is an application window opening, which will close in September. And you get funding from DEFRA and support from DEFRA, and we don't know how many they will award this year. Last year they put it up, but they had many good applications and increased the numbers. So very much worthwhile applying. And if during the development phase, you will plan your implementation phase, and this would be expected to be for greater than 20 years. And landscape recovery can be on land that is in another government or non-governmental scheme. So, if you are already in stewardship, if part of the land is already in stewardship, that is not a barrier to going into a landscape recovery scheme. But you wouldn't get paid twice on the same bit of land. It's a bit like you can't have SFI for doing the same thing as in stewardship. Similarly, you can't get a landscape recovery payment for doing something if you're already having that land in stewardship. You may choose to, as when you go into landscape recovery, to terminate that, but it does mean you can sort of hedge your bets during the development phase because you're not being paid for land management actions. And that's one way of testing the waters as you go forward. In terms of during the development phase, the landscape recovery scheme is quite complex. There's a lot of obligations in terms of it because it's covering multiple types of activities, often with multiple owners. And here's a list taken from the DEFRA website of what you would be expected to work on during your development phase for implementation. And these are all the components you require. So some things like a land management plan is fairly obvious, require that. Project management and governance, so what are the structures? And Josie will be talking more about that. A monitoring and evaluation plan. So remembering if these schemes are going to be more than 20 years, it's really important that you monitor the progress in delivering your outcomes and evaluate that, and then we'll need regular reviews. How will you engage with stakeholders, all the legal interests over that on that piece of land? So that may be will be tenants, owners, commoners. There will be other people with easements and rights of way, and then there will be local parish councils, particularly when you're working at scale, and other businesses that are involved and use that area. But one of the key elements of landscape recovery is that they are encouraging improvement of access. So you need to demonstrate how you will be improving public access. And this can be managed public access. It may be an area already that has open access, but really important to look at that aspect. Then the business model. How are you actually going to function? How are the cash flow going to work? And so to make sure that you're going to be able to deliver what you've set out to do. And finally, but not at all least, will be the legal agreements, for both the legal agreements for private finance and then the legal agreements for public finance. These will be separate legal agreements, but they're both required, because one of the key aspects of landscape recovery is that you are expected to have private as well as public finance. I'll come on to that in a moment. But in terms of the governance, the why is it that you need a clear governance structure? You both need to know who's responsible for doing what, so which parties are involved. You may have two farms that are next door to each other with a river running through both. Who's going to be doing work? Are you coordinating your activities to make sure if you're doing river restoration work, if there's in terms of scrub management, if there's in terms of tree planting, so coordinating activities, because the whole idea is that the principles are bigger, better, more joined up. So the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. You need to be able to manage the funds and mitigate risks. And a big thing is, how do you adapt to changes in ownership, changes in the environment? We have climate change happening. What's going to be, how are you going to respond to changes during a long agreement? And there's opportunity for reviews within that. DEFRA will work with you to tailor the governance arrangements, and they will be put in place during project development. You will certainly need lawyers involved with this to make this work when you've got multiple parties involved. And then there will be a single implementation agreement for each project. So one of the areas we'll come on to, and Joe will be talking about, is the difference between having multiple CS agreements working together compared with landscape recovery. But landscape recovery is about a single implementation agreement across the whole of the land. So in terms of blended finance, this is another area that distinguishes landscape recovery from countryside stewardship, is that DEFRA says that landscape recovery costs are to be funded by a mixture of private and public funding. They're expecting implementation costs, so that's the cost to be in between of doing the activities, between £200 to £900 per hectare. Huge variation there, clearly depends where you are, what you're doing. There may be capital works as well. And the public funds are designed to complement the private investment. There's lots more text on gov.uk, but it's very much where private investment falls short, then public funds step in. So it's rather different to, where public money falls short than private investment. They've framed it the other way around. So they will help you identify, DEFRA will help you identify where public funding is needed for your project viability. They're not those specifying a minimum percentage from private sources, but it will be something where clearly they will be looking to see where you can find money from private sources. Now, it may be that the land managers, the farmers, the landowners, the commoners, the tenants are already doing a lot of land management already, so that there will be work that's being undertaken that's going on at the moment that can then be included as match funding there, as well as from other sources. Finally, as Lyndsey has already mentioned, we have a toolkit. If you go onto the Foundation for Common Land website, so it's foundationforcommonland.org.uk. In the top right-hand corner, we have our Common Land Toolkit button, and you go through, choose which of the 9 arches you would like to go through. If you go through the environmental schemes arch and you go through onto landscape recovery, we have various pages there. What is landscape recovery? And you have these sort of blue boxes, and you can click in and click through to more information, particularly, working with others at scale, conservation governance, and then clicking through to how do you work on commons and governance structures. So I hope that's given you an insight into the sort of policy situation. Any queries you've got, we'll do our best to answer them. If we can't answer them, we'll go back to DEFRA and ask them as well. But just wanted to say thanks very much for listening, and we look forward to hearing your questions. Put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom. And now I'd stop sharing my screen, and we'll move on to the next section. So I'm absolutely delighted today to introduce Josie Edwards. Josie's been presented on one of our webinars before. Josie is a partner at Michelmores, who are a firm of solicitors. She's based in Bristol, and they have a huge specialty in working in this area of structures for delivering conservation benefits. And Josie's now done her second piece of work for this test and trial, and it's absolutely fascinating to read and provides a lot of food for thought. So Josie, lovely to have you with us, and over to you.
Many thanks, Julia, for that introduction. I've really thoroughly enjoyed working with the Foundation for Common Land on this test and trial project over the last 12 months. As Julia's already mentioned, my focus has been on the question of what structure and legal documentation is actually required to facilitate collaboration across landscapes involving common land and involving multiple stakeholders, and how do you safeguard investments made in landscape scale environmental recovery. Now, common land obviously raises a lot of specific issues and complexities. Any arrangements are going to have to take account of and reflect existing rights of common, and have to bring together a multitude of stakeholders. And you won't be surprised to hear that the sort of main message from my brief talk tonight is that collaboration and sharing a common purpose and a goal is going to be the crucial requirement of any larger scale, more ambitious collaborative scheme. All landowners, occupiers, rights holders and stakeholders are going to have to want to be involved and very much on the journey together. Now, as has already been flagged by Lyndsey and Julia, we've considered 2 possible governance options, one focused on the landscape recovery scheme proposal, and the other the rebranded countryside stewardship and CS Plus schemes. And I'm going to look at both briefly this evening. So back in January, at the first webinar, I spoke in particular about the governance structure and an example governance structure for landscape recovery. Julia's covered some additional details on this now, just flagging that it's DEFRA's new top tier under ELMS, and it's very much the most ambitious scheme. And we are now starting to see some more details as DEFRA move forward into phase 2, the development phase. But we do still need to keep in mind that it's a proposal. The scheme is still very much at the design stage, and that's what this test and trial process is all about. It's about helping DEFRA design the scheme. So the policy context is constantly evolving, but we're not expecting it to be one size fits all. From the information we've got, DEFRA are very much anticipating that these schemes will be unique, they'll be bespoke and individually designed. And so likewise, the costs might vary significantly the more complex the scheme in terms of the number of collaborators or the outcomes or interventions. Obviously, the higher the costs will be, both for setup and ongoing management. So against that backdrop, I just wanted to share again what we thought the governance will look like in a landscape recovery scale scheme. As in January, I'm using a Malvern Hills sort of notional scheme as a case study to provide some context. One key point to flag is there's very much scope for flexibility in the structure. It could be tweaked or scaled up or down to fit the specific situation or scheme proposed. But broadly, and this is now becoming clearer as DEFRA guidance is released, there will be a primary lead implementation agreement for each landscape recovery scheme or project that's entered into with DEFRA. So Julia's flagged this already. That's going to be the main contractual basis for the scheme and the public funding that flows under it. And the signatory would be a single entity representing the scheme participants. So that's referred to as the lead applicant. Now, we think that the lead implementation agreement will annex and refer to various subsidiary agreements, and together all those agreements will achieve the delivery of the scheme objectives, and they will ensure that the various elements and the parties are all contractually bound to deliver the scheme, despite not being direct signatories to the lead agreement. So it's one document or one piece in a much larger jigsaw. That structure allows government to contract with one single entity. It focuses management control and responsibility on one entity. But of course, that needs to be an entity that's representative of and for the stakeholders. Julie has flagged the fact that DEFRA have confirmed that the eligible lead applicant needn't be a landowner or a land manager. And in many instances, particularly for more complex long-term landscape recovery schemes with significant funding flowing under them, we think a new corporate special purpose vehicle, an SPV, is likely to be the most appropriate option. Now, exactly what sort of SPV entity is appropriate will vary from scheme to scheme, because you can use a range of legal structures, but whatever legal vehicle is used, the structure would essentially enable a joint venture enterprise to be set up between a number of interested parties and stakeholders. And we think that will be attractive in the context of landscape schemes where no one party will have overall management or ownership control. SPVs provide scope to create a recognisable, legally sound entity to manage the funding and the liabilities under the scheme. And it also provides flexibility to diversify into other income streams in future without being an overly complex structure. It's essentially a simple model, and crucially, it's one that's well understood. And that's a key point because it links into the private finance point that Julia has flagged. Private funding, blended green finance, will feed into that core structure, but will be documented by way of separate agreements between the lead applicant, the representative body, and the private funders. So that's document 4 in my diagram on your screen, so the orange document, but that will again be underpinned by multiple documents. The landscape recovery lead implementation agreement will be designed by DEFRA to complement the private investment that a scheme is able to secure. Moving on to look at some of the other agreements. Just briefly, we anticipate that there will be fairly widespread use of conservation covenants. Now, these covenants are focused on the land and securing the ambitions of the scheme and the land use change over the long term. So they're not focused on who will do that or how it's going to be funded, but on binding the land that is put into a scheme effectively for the long term. And that's a key point to remember. And that happens because conservation covenants will bind successors in title and they will run with the land. So in the quite likely event of the sale of any freehold interest during these 20, 30 plus year terms, or any changes in occupation if leases come to an end, for example, or new agreements are granted, they will all be subject to the conservation covenants terms. And we're, of course, talking about much longer term agreements than those currently seen under HLS schemes, etc. They're intended to deliver hopefully lasting environmental change, and people will want to see that being protected. Now, conservation covenants are just about live. Last week, the government finally published guidance on how you can apply to be a responsible body, and they are the essential counterparty to a conservation covenant. It's the responsible body who will ensure that the objectives of the covenant are secured and delivered. And we now just need to wait and see which organisations might be willing to apply to be responsible bodies, because it's a fairly significant responsibility. There's lots of information and detailed guidance now on the government website, and we also covered it in the January webinar in more detail. But another key point just to draw out again this evening is that the legislation under the Environment Act requires the covenantor to hold a qualifying estate in land, and that's defined as either a freehold estate or a tenant holding a long lease, a lease of more than for a term of more than 7 years. And so on that basis, commoners don't have legal standing to enter into a conservation covenant, because a right of common is a form of profit a prondra, not a freehold or leasehold estate. So conservation covenants can be created in relation to common land by the landowners, but they will of course be subject to the registered common rights that affect that land. And all such rights will have to be considered before the covenant is entered into, and the covenant's terms must be compatible with those rights. So in summary, we think conservation covenants are likely to be one of the key tools in delivery, but they might not be needed in every case. So, for example, shorter agreements, it might not be necessary to have an additional conservation covenant alongside the other contractual agreements. And even if used, they are, again, only one of the documents in the overall jigsaw. So the other document or documents, I'm calling it document 3, but it might be multiple, is the management agreement. And this is a really pivotal, crucial part of our contractual structure. It's under this agreement that the allocation of the funding, the obligations and liabilities would be divided up between the interested parties and the stakeholders over the duration of the scheme. It's effectively the delivery document on the ground. And in the slide, given some examples of the likely parties, again, basing it around the Malvern Hills as our case study scenario. So it's here that the detail will appear. Who will be paid for what, how much, when? And it's very much akin to the internal agreements that many of you will already be familiar with in the context of HLS schemes on commons. The active commoners who would deliver some of the management obligations would therefore be parties to this agreement alongside freehold owners and other stakeholders who might assist with capital works or management, perhaps directly or via a commons association or council. There may be multiple management agreements, as I said, that was likely to vary from scheme to scheme. I'll come back to consider them in a bit more detail shortly, but first I just wanted to consider one of the alternatives we've been looking at in more recent months, which is a set of connected countryside stewardship plus agreements. Now, we still have very little detail on DEFRA's plans for CS plus. The press releases back in January confirmed it will reward farmers for taking coordinated action, working with neighbouring farms and landowners to support climate and nature aims. And we know that additional funding is going to be available for collaborative delivery between adjoining landowners, but no detail on what that might look like or how much. We know that CS Plus is likely to be shorter term than landscape recovery and less ambitious in terms of the land area, the number of collaborators and the outcomes, etc. But it very much remains to be seen what level of contractual linkage will be required by DEFRA, or what the conditions will be to ensure that collaboration happens. But I've set out on the slide a sort of possible collaborative landscape structure utilising CS agreements. And we can see scope for several neighbouring or linked CS Plus agreements, which will complement one another and each be underpinned by an internal agreement. So effectively, you end up with a nest of CS schemes and internal agreements across a landscape. If CS Plus is designed to allow standalone agreements without direct linkage, then the structure wouldn't require the lead signatory envisaged for landscape recovery. But I think probably some sort of overarching agreement or contract tying them all together is likely to be required, but that is to be confirmed. Internal management agreements will undoubtedly be required on common land to secure the delivery of the scheme and confirm the obligations and the rewards for all of those participating in delivering it. So again, these internal agreements I'm anticipating would include the commoners either directly or perhaps via a commons association. If CS Plus is used and the CS agreements themselves are linked, then the internal agreements could be linked as well, and it might be beneficial to do that. You could consider a single overarching grazier scheme perhaps that would support a number of CS Plus schemes. That seems quite practical and sensible because it will allow a coordinated approach across commons, which are obviously unfenced without proper delineated boundaries. And we understand that I understand that's happening already in the New Forest in the context of existing schemes. Just thinking about the SPV structure I mentioned in the context of landscape recovery, it's possible that an SPV or a lead signatory might still be appropriate if you've got circumstances where delivery and outcomes are fully contingent on several CS agreements being delivered. But particularly, I think it's likely to be something worth exploring if the CS Plus scheme holders wanted to collaborate to accept private finance. And it's certainly something to bear in mind and to perhaps look into if this route becomes a feasible option. So back to the management agreement, the internal agreement, because that's such a key document in both example structures, I think. As I say, mentioned already, it secures the delivery of the scheme terms. It deals with the allocation of funding and obligations between those delivering the scheme. This is the agreement that would also contain key provisions dealing with default, breach, enforcement, etc. So dealing with those aspects, with penalties and with dispute resolution. I'd anticipate they would have indemnities between the signatories to ensure that any losses suffered by the wider group in the event of breach is underwritten and reimbursed by the defaulting party. They would also need to deal with novation and transfer provisions for successors in title so that they take on the obligations of their predecessors and therefore ensure the release of parties from the scheme and the obligations if they cease to own or occupy land or cease to be a commons right holder. So effectively, we're talking about provisions to deal with life events, death, divorce, land sales, new tenancies. Again, the complexity will vary depending on the complexity of the scheme and the range and number of participants, etc. So before I finish, just wanted to go back or focus in more detail on the role of commoners. Now, it goes without saying that they are pivotal on schemes involving common land. Any scheme is going to require their input and is going to need to take account of pre-existing commons rights. They can't be ignored or overridden by these sorts of schemes. So if the scheme will require management which restricts or limits commoners' rights, which is potentially quite likely, then it's going to be vital that the active commoners sign up to it and are contributing parties. And so for that reason, I think schemes very much will have to be co-designed. They have got to be attractive to everyone. This has got to be a collaborative process that delivers benefits to everyone. And for everyone to want to sign up to. And no doubt some of the grazing and the management activities required under these schemes will need to be delivered by or in partnership with active commoners. So those entering into schemes or any covenants and agreements underpinning them must be confident they can comply with the scheme terms and their obligations, and that delivery won't be jeopardized or hasn't taken into account commons rights. And so in turn, that will require those who hold commons rights to be willing and happy to engage in the scheme, because the management requirements may well differ from their legal rights of common. And so essentially, commoners are likely to need to agree to exercise their rights, or indeed not exercise them in a particular way. And so that's where the management and internal agreement comes in. It's a contract that will sit alongside existing commons rights and regulate the use of the land that's in the scheme for the duration. I would suggest that you need to consider the use of commons associations or councils as a signatory to the internal agreement, with the management of individuals holding common rights then perhaps undertaken by the association. But the big key to unlock all of this is going to be the funding. The money flowing under these schemes has got to be attractive to all participants and available and attractive to everyone, including commoners. The money has got to filter down. And, you know, in theory, landscape recovery and CS Plus have very much got scope to replace BPS income. And I hope that that will be the case. And DEFRA are saying that payment structures should provide a steady and reliable income stream for land managers. So these agreements are intended to be financial transactions, and the funding has got to be sufficiently attractive to ensure engagement. Now, the position of non-active commoners is potentially more problematic, particularly in that the likely circumstance where a scheme might seek to limit or control how they might exercise their rights in future. So I'm talking here about those people who don't use their commons rights and so simply don't wish to be involved, or those who can't be traced perhaps. They might be in their hundreds in relation to some common areas of common. And I think the only practical answer is to try and utilise commons associations for the landscape in question, and also to design sufficient flexibility into schemes. There's going to be a risk assessment that will need to be undertaken on a scheme by scheme basis as to what risk non-active commoners becoming active and wanting to exercise their rights in future might pose to the design of a scheme. And finally, just one more thing to note is that existing statutory protections or designations, for example, AONB designations, SSSIs, will need to be considered, and the terms of any proposed scheme will have to reflect any such designations. And that's obviously a key point when thinking about common land. All commons that are part of a SSSI require consent for ORNEX, and so that admittedly very complex interaction needs to be considered as well in the scheme design and the engagement with commoners and occupiers. So just some concluding comments from me at this point. I think there isn't one size fits all, and context, parties, the nature of the scheme and the deliverables people are aiming for will feed into the design. Landscape recovery in particular is intended to be bespoke. It is really ambitious, and so it will have to be underpinned by collaboration with everyone working together, as I said, and I think that really is the crucial requirement of any larger scale scheme. But delivering at landscape scale doesn't necessarily mean landscape recovery is the only mechanism, and I hope that CS Plus will provide really good, viable alternatives. In any scenario, it's going to be a bit of a risk management exercise and a question of being realistic about the practicalities of particular commons and landscapes. There will be transaction costs and risk which escalate with larger agreements and a greater number of participants. So there is a cost benefit calculation to be made. And in practice, many commons may prefer an agreement covering a smaller management commons unit rather than contractually linking several commons or a mix of common and non-common land. We might also see common land continuing in the main in shorter term schemes like CS and CS Plus, at least in the short to medium term, due to existing relationships of trust. The consequences and risk of breach being lower in shorter term, smaller landscape schemes. But obviously the funding and the reward available might be significantly lower as a result of that. And it's going to be really interesting to see what the first landscape recovery schemes look like and how commonplace landscape recovery and CS Plus might be in years to come and how accessible they really are. I hope they will be. I think there's a potential for such a wide range of benefits, but as I say, the policy is not set and it's a sort of constantly moving environment at the moment. Many thanks for listening. I hope there was something useful in there for everyone. We've worked with the Foundation for Common Land to produce a range of resources to sort of add to the website and assist Commons. So there's outline heads of terms and some example heads of terms and dispute resolution clauses, etc., which will be available soon. But at that point, I'm going to hand back to Lyndsey and stop sharing my screen. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Josie. What's really reassuring is in your concluding remarks, it really reflects the conversations that we've had with landowners, land managers and commoners. There is huge potential in landscape recovery for commons, but there has to be a very careful analysis of the risks and the benefits for each individual area of common land. And again, the cost benefit calculation is critical. The other really, really important point that we will be really passing on to DEFRA is the importance of the benefits and what comes to the landowners and to the commoners has to be worthwhile. And we do need to ensure the longevity of commoning systems so that they deliver for people and nature. So thank you so much, Josie, for all the work that you've done over the past several months now. It's been extremely useful for SCL, and as you say, the resources will be available on the Common Land Toolkit, and we will endeavour to keep them updated. Everything we've done with landscape recovery and all of the ELM schemes comes with the health warning that there are shifting sands, and sometimes things change even when we think that they are clear and set in stone. So I'm going to pass on now to Joe, who's going to talk through some of the scenarios that could work for delivering multiple outcomes on Lowland Commons. And Joe's going to be focusing on the Malvern Hills. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Lyndsey, and thanks, Josie. Some really interesting information there for everybody. Just get my slides up. Everybody can see those. So yeah, as Lyndsey mentioned, my name's Joe Leifer. I'm a test and trial facilitator here in the Malvern Hills for this landscape recovery test and trial project. As part of this, part of the work we've been doing here in the Malvern Hills and in the New Forest as well, we've been looking at the different options for each area for delivering multiple outcomes at landscape scale through ELM. So, what are your options with CS plus landscape recovery in each area? So I'm going to outline some of those now. We've worked with the Malvern Hills Trust, been through some of these options, see which ones they think are most appealing to them, and also which ones they think would work best or are most likely or unlikely to work in the Malvern Hills. And then we're going to have a little chat with Matt Gardner, who's a commoner and grazes the hills here in cooperation with the Malvern Hills Trust as part of a CS scheme on Castle Morton Common. So I'll just start by quickly going over some of the general options that you might have for delivering at landscape scale through ELM. So you could have one large countryside stewardship that covered landscape scale, but this would obviously depend on whether DEFRA would let you have a scheme that large through CS. You could have multiple individual CS schemes, which is what Malvern Hills Trust has at the moment, CS and HLS, or you could have multiple linked CS schemes, as Josie alluded to earlier, where you could have CS plus, which would be incentives for linking up schemes and collaborating across the landscape, with various schemes collaborating together to achieve additional outcomes to what they're achieving individually. But we need more information on that from DEFRA. It's all still very much in development. Or you could have one landscape recovery scheme, which we've been into in some detail in this webinar and the previous ones, which we've looked at in more detail in this test and trial. Or you could have a countryside stewardship CS scheme, the current sort of business as usual, with a landscape recovery scheme for something else involved. Those are sort of the 5 options that we established that you could have. So at this point in time, just a bit of background. The Malvern Hills Trust on their area of common land have 4 CS and 1 HLS scheme active at the moment. So here you can see the map of the common land running along the Malvern Hills, and you've got all of the 5 schemes there running at the moment. So it's very much at a landscape scale already, delivering through multiple CS and 1 HLS scheme. So it's already delivering at a landscape scale, but through multiple schemes. So now if we take that and then we look at what we did was we looked at some scenarios, speaking to Malvern Hills Trust, and looking at what would be the most likely scenarios that they would see delivering at landscape scale, and that they'd be most interested in. So we had the first one, which is the business as usual scenario under CS and HLS. So that would be continuing and extending, well, they already have been extended, the current agreements and schemes, but maybe doing that even further into the future, delivering at landscape scale through that. And that was, we're going from most likely to least likely in terms of what is likely to be taken up and delivered here, taking into consideration all of the governance requirements, appetite of Malvern Hills Trust and other landowners to enter into these schemes in the area. So starting most likely that scenario at the top, that business as usual one. And then on to scenario 2, which would be here you would have Malvern Hills Trust run landscape recovery scheme, but so you would have the CS and HLS schemes, so just CS in the future, HLS will discontinued, and then you would have a landscape recovery scheme that could be specific for a certain project that's not being delivered through, currently being delivered through CS on the common land. So this could be a species reintroduction or whatever, it's something ambitious that you could get, even if it was just for the development phase, you know, you'd still have that CS funding to keep going, delivering the things you are delivering, but then perhaps through this development phase, 2 years for landscape recovery, and perhaps moving that into the implementation phase, you could be delivering something above and beyond what you're currently delivering that could be more ambitious across the whole landscape alongside that. And then the third scenario we established would be bringing together CS and HLS schemes into one CS scheme. So this was not seen as very likely because there's, first of all, you lose some of the distribution of risk that comes when you have multiple CS and HLS schemes in terms of payments being withheld or things like that. So, you know, you're putting all of your eggs in one basket, that sort of thing. So yeah, that was seen as likely, and at that scale, you're not likely to get one CS scheme for the whole. In the future, you're probably not really likely to get one CS scheme that will cover the whole of Malvern Hills. So that's was seen as a less likely scenario. And again, and then scenario 4 was looking at a very ambitious, large scale landscape recovery scheme that would perhaps bring in and work with the AONB, the Malvern Hills AONB, linking in local nature recovery strategy and local farmers, you know, a very large sort of ambitious scheme. We did see that as quite unlikely just because of the complexity of setting up such a large scheme and the reasonably low staff capacity of the AONB and the Malvern Hills Trust to manage such a large scheme, and the financing that would be needed to carry out that amount of work, and the risk associated with that. Again, bringing everything into one scheme, you know, you are taking a higher risk in terms of putting everything together, and the complexity of bringing in common land and non-common land and all of the different organizations and their management practices and the risks associated with that. So that was in discussion with Malvern Hills Trust and other landowners. They would see that as quite unlikely scenario, actually, although it could be very ambitious, it was quite unlikely. And then the last one was bringing the current CS and HLS schemes into a landscape recovery scheme, but perhaps with some bespoke options on top of that. So it's unlikely that you move your current CS schemes into one landscape recovery scheme because you're already delivering that through countryside stewardship. So you're not going to there's no need to move that into a landscape recovery scheme. However, if you could add some bespoke options into that might be a possibility. And, you know, that could be something that you could do, to add some bespoke options into that. But again, it's that loss of distribution of risk. So you're putting all of your schemes into that one scheme, and it's more complicated. So yeah, again, that's a less likely scenario. We went through discussion with the Malvern Hills Trust, we saw that was a less likely scenario. Yeah, so those are the 5 scenarios that we established for the Malverns and for landscape delivery through ELM. And I'm just going to bring in Matt now. If somebody could highlight Matt for me, please bring him in. Hi, Matt.
Hello, good evening.
All right. So I just want, you know, if you want to give yourself a quick introduction, who you are, what you're doing in the Malvern Hills.
Yes, certainly. My name's Matt Gardner, so I'm the chairman of the Castleton Commons Association. So we're the sort of lowland common that are in a CS agreement, sort of at the foot of the Malvern Hills. There are 7 of us in that CS agreement, 7 active commoners that graze predominantly sheep and cattle. This is our 2nd year in the agreement. So we've sort of been working with Joseph, sort of involved in this project to see really what options are available for the future.
Okay, great. Thanks, Matt. So I'll just, ask you a couple of questions and discuss some of these points for people who are attending the webinar today. So I think a good first question to ask you would be, do you think that in the Malvern Hills we're currently delivering effective landscape scale outcomes through ELM, or what more do you think could be done? Are there any issues you'd like to highlight, or any things you think could be done better, or anything we could be more ambitious about, or that ELM could help assist?
I think something that would and could be useful is the kind of long-term ambition. I'm not convinced by the covenants and the sort of legally binding ideas, but I think a long-term ambition and vision of what we want to achieve and how we're going to achieve it through hopefully schemes that can sort of roll on from one to another fairly seamlessly without having sort of breaks when schemes end and having to reapply and do a lot of sort of really quite complex and time-consuming work, when in fact really our aims and objectives should pretty much stay the same. I think they're protected sites, they're obviously got full public access, we've got triple SI status on a considerable part of it, so really our aims and objectives shouldn't change that much, so it should be reasonably simple, I think, is the key for all involved.
Okay, great, thanks. And so if we look at these scenarios that we discussed before, with the first two, the business as usual CS and HLS, which is the most likely one, and then the one below, which is the CS, and then looking at a separate landscape recovery scheme, what kind of additional things do you think would be good to see from a ELM scheme that is currently not being delivered through CS or HLS? Any specific options you think could be beneficial?
Options that could come in is more sort of outreach work, I think, to kind of make we on the Commons sort of know what we're doing and we know why we're doing it. But I think certainly as the countryside sees more and more visitors, the demographics of people living in the area, we say, changes considerably. I think more sort of outreach to schools and to the wider sort of community as to actually what goes on Commons, what sort of is involved in their management, and just, I think, as Lyndsey touched on earlier, just how sort of important they are in the day-to-day life for an awful lot of people. So I think some sort of outreaching program would be good, sort of interpret what we're doing for those that don't necessarily know.
Okay, great, thanks. Is there anything else you'd like to add? So we'll bring in,
I think, I mean, on the scenarios, I think realistically, the kind of business as usual, as I say, making the long-term transitions more simple. I think the kind of ability to perhaps pair common land and non-common land in a single agreement would be useful, because we've got sort of common land and then land adjoining the common, that can't go in one agreement, which makes a big sort of administrative burden, even though some of that land is sort of owned by people that are delivering the scheme. I think that would be good. I think looking at the larger sort of schemes with the conservation covenants, I think that would be tricky really to implement. I don't think you could easily sell it to certainly a lot of the landowners around the hills and commons, just because sort of issues of families and succession planning is all very complex and sort of difficult in a farming situation. I think if you start adding in those types of things, covenants and potential effects on land values and restrictions, I think it'd be very hard for people to swallow. Although I sort of like the principle of it, I don't think in practice it's something that you could get a lot of people to go for in the situation that we've got around here. I think in other areas, probably if you've got bigger estates, bigger chunks of land owned by single people, it might work. But I think that would be a sort of bridge too far. sort of personalities and demographics that we've got around here. Probably.
All right, great. Yeah, that's really good insights there. Thanks, Matt. Lyndsey, bring Lyndsey and Andrew to talk about similar sort of scenarios and what they'd be looking at in the New Forest, delivering at landscape scale through ELM.
That's great. Thanks, Joe. Would you mind bringing us back to the video rather than screen sharing? That's brilliant. Thanks. And Andy, can we bring you in as well?
Yeah, hello. Yep.
Fantastic. So I've got a question for Andrew, and then I'm going to ask some questions for both of you, actually. Andy, do you feel ready to make a decision about which landscape scale options are best for your common? Now, before you answer that, could you just introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, my name's Andrew Parry-Norton. I'm the chairman of the Commons Defence Association, and also I'm the vice chair of the Forest Funding Group, which is a multi-organisational group that the objective is to look at potentially a scheme that we could enter into. Now, going back to your question on that one, is we are a long way off going into any scheme at this stage. We are working through potentially going into a PA2 study, but at the moment, timescale, we are a long way off deciding. The issues we have, I think, is we have several organisations, stakeholders, landowners within the forest, which makes it very, very difficult.
And with regards to, for both of you, do you feel that confident that the landscape scale schemes being developed by DEFRA will deliver for your commons? So often we think we try and fit our objectives to the scheme. And Matt, I think your point about having a vision and actually the long-term delivery being relatively similar in landscapes that are well managed, we need a long-term vision. Do you feel that ELM, as it's on the table now, will deliver well for you? So Andy first.
No, unfortunately at the moment, it's like I explained, we've got such a blend and mixture of people here in the forest itself. The verderers, National Park, Forest England, obviously the commoners. And for us to try and get a scheme that works for commoners, the commoners are being trying to fit into schemes where it should be the other way around. What we should have is a scheme that works for the commoners, not trying to get the commoners to fit into a scheme. And at the moment, looking at what's available on the table, I think the options we've got, and potentially in my words, is maybe almost like a hybrid scheme. So a bespoke scheme that will fit the forest, but somewhere where we can pull bits in and develop a scheme that will work for everybody.
And Matt?
I think sadly at the moment, there's still probably more questions than answers when it comes to elms. So at the moment, I think it's hard to see it as a kind of viable path for us when you've got, I mean, we've obviously got a lot less than you guys in the New Forest, a lot less people to kind of gel together to try and deliver something. But I think, yeah, trying to fit something, like as Andy says, trying to fit a scheme, design a scheme that works for the specific area instead of the kind of one size fits all, and then trying somehow to get a variety of different farming systems that sort of work in it. I think that this bespoke design has got to be sort of way forward, definitely.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. If we could bring Julia and Josie back in, and we'll look at our Q&A questions. So if you have any further questions, please add them to the Q&A. We're here, we're ready to talk. I've got a question that was emailed to us that I think would be a really super one to start with. And we've got Josie, fantastic. So I'm just going to read the question that was sent to us because I think it's quite useful for a lot of people listening. We the landowner, jointly with the court leet that manages the surface of the moor for the benefit of the sheep grazing commoners, would like to consider both a peatland restoration scheme and potentially a tree planting scheme. There are no tenancies involved. Only 5 graziers, sheep, exercise their rights, but there are many more who hold rights but don't exercise them. The grazing is already extensive as required under a separate HLS agreement. In practice, neither the peatland scheme nor an extensive, probably unfenced tree planting scheme will materially impact on the current graziers. But in theory, at least, the currently non-grazing graziers could exercise their rights in the future. So we could get into a situation where the requirements of either or both schemes could reduce the amount of grazing available to a point where it becomes material. All our graziers have protected rights. Do we have the right to impose either or both schemes, or do we need the agreement of the graziers? If we need their agreement, do we only need the agreement of the active graziers, or do the non-grazing commoners need to be involved? We think it likely that the active graziers will give unanimous support for both schemes, but if the non-grazing commoners need to be involved, can a single grazier block a scheme, or would we be safe to proceed if supported by a majority? There's a lot in there, but I think there's a lot of things that we've discussed over the past few months wrapped up in there. Josie, would you like to start?
Thanks, Lyndsey. There is a lot in there. I think the first point to note is that the scheme will have to be designed assessing those risks and the likelihood of the non-active graziers sort of rearing their head in future. I think there would be an obligation probably, and I think this is similar to existing schemes, to notify all those holding rights of what is proposed and sort of canvass opinion and give them an opportunity to respond, and to then design a scheme in a way that those that do exercise their rights support. But it is complex, and there's no way around the complexity of how many people have rights, and it's about considering and risk assessing which rights are actually being used, making sure that those people are, as your question flagged, on board with the scheme and willing to support it. And it might be that payments and money flowing is a way of making sure that people will be willing to sign up and engage with it, but it will be very fact specific depending on what's proposed in each case, I think, and not easy. I'm not going to promise that it will be straightforward, and you know, the question and answers in the Q&A are flagging how complex this is likely to be in some instances involving common lands, or many instances.
Yeah. Could I just add into that, Lyndsey?
Yeah, of course, Julia.
Thank you. A great question. I mean, this happens at the moment anyway. I think where Josie's sort of one of the really important points she raises around risk is that if the longer the agreement, the more likely you're going to have risks, and that's sort of inherent really in the question as well, isn't it, that change occurs, and how do you make sure that you can manage change and also allow new people to come in, because it might be that people will die, people will get divorced, and people will sell their properties during a 20-30 year scheme. And it's a matter of, it can be positive to have new people coming in, because you could be in a position where you're down to a very few graziers and actually you require more. At the same time, there may be risks if you end up with too many people grazing. That's why Josie mentioned that you need to have, for instance, if one person disrupts the scheme, then you need to be able to take action against them. They become liable in a sense for losses occurring. But my top tip with this is to consult with everybody. Thinking you can just leave people out is a really, really bad approach. Many people have tried this in the past, and it almost always ends in tears. So I spent 10 years setting up HLS schemes, and then 10 years being paid to sort out the mess on other people's HLS schemes where they hadn't included everyone in the internal agreement, or they weren't properly structured. So although it seems the investment in solicitors' fees and getting a good solid agreement at the beginning can seem a lot, it actually saves a lot in the long term. So my advice to the questioner is to involve everybody and engage people in the scheme. Some commoners actually prefer longer schemes because if they're committing to tree planting, they will prefer to know that land is, for instance, taken out for 20, 30 years rather than being left with some scraggy trees in 10 years' time and a fence that's not properly looked after. So I think there are pluses and minuses, but it's the transaction costs and the time required, and this is something that Andy was very much emphasizing, and that is important. You need to take time. Luckily, I believe on the New Forest, you have, there's a 5-year HLS rollover, so that provides a little bit of leeway, though conscious also that BPS is declining very fast, so people are feeling that they've got significant financial losses.
So shall we go to some of the questions in the Q&A? So Dominic Fairman has asked, will a landscape recovery involving multiple CS plus schemes be likely to attract enough funding to make up for the loss of BPS and any existing HLS? Julia, I don't know if that's one you would like to answer.
Absolutely. Delighted to, and thanks, Dominic, for the question. The answer is it depends, because we don't know how much money DEFRA are going to put into schemes, and there's no budget guaranteed after the next general election, which will be sometime in the next 18 months. So the 24-25, the budget, that's the final agreed budget. So once you've signed into a scheme, then the government is committed, to pay that money until any break clause. I think what perhaps Dominic's getting here is that if you just have a CS scheme which is publicly funded, does that mean there's less money than a landscape recovery? What probably a point we haven't emphasised enough is that you can have multiple CS schemes and also enter into private agreements as well. I think that is included in Josie's option. So just going for CS plus doesn't preclude having private agreements. I think anybody who where Lyndsey made these really important points about how important common land is, and delivering for nature, delivering for climate, brings huge economic benefits to the nation. And so making a strong case for more money going in is important. Whether it's going to make up for your loss of BPS will depend a lot whether you're on, for instance, the forest, where the BPS has been a very significant component for commoners and HLS less, or whether you're in upland commons where they've been often equal. On the uplands, we are expecting some more news in September, and it's looking as though payment rates, if you deliver significantly for public goods, will be significantly increased. But there's no such thing as a free lunch with any of this. So sorry, perhaps you could ask, I think it may be an answer for the politicians and whatever Rishi Sunak's view on the environment is today.
Another really interesting question from Dominic Fairman. What type of outcomes would private investors be looking for in areas that are already SSSIs?
I don't know, Josie, whether you've got any views on this. Whether you've come across this in terms of investors yet.
No, not specifically, but I was just looking at the DEFRA guidance on that in response to Dominic's question, because it's a really good one. And they are saying that they are open to paying for a range of activities, including ongoing management of areas in good condition. So I suppose the first question is, what sort of condition is your SSSI in? And then very much looking to pay for activities to deliver enhanced environmental outcomes. So that's DEFRA's kind of position on how it would be designed. But private investors, I think it could vary depending on, it will vary depending on what is proposed on each scheme. I feel like I keep saying that, but the key point is that there might be a whole range of opportunities, water resource benefits, biodiversity improvements, etc. And I don't really see that would necessarily be prevented from happening on SSSIs.
So the additional benefits is what we're saying is that they're the features of interest that the SSSI is designated for, and that might be better funded with public money. But the plus benefits, Josie, is that you're referring to, that you're providing an addition to the SSSI features of interest, then private investors are more likely to pay for something that isn't your obligation to deliver anyway, because they would want, that might be something that would be more of an interest to them. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously not going to be paying for something that the land manager is already obliged to do. But what I'm saying is that I don't see any reason why there couldn't be additional enhancements and improvements made to SSSI land that private investors could be involved in funding and helping to achieve. I think that's probably the point I was trying to make.
Yeah,
and I think we've got a couple of extra questions that I can put in together. David Richards has commented that this is so damn complicated, with commoners who do not use the commons and are all elderly and also not farming anymore. How can you form a commons council when no one is interested? This is so bureaucratic. I'm going to add into that, Henry Raymond has commented that DEFRA input on this will be major. How are they going to procure this? Will it be made a responsibility of Natural England, who are already under-resourced and particularly understaffed? Or will it be passed out to third-party bodies such as land agency firms? We currently find it almost impossible to get advice and feedback from Natural England on our existing HLS scheme, let alone getting timely feedback on BPS queries. Therefore, we have little confidence that if we invested what is needed to get a scheme off the ground, that we would get sufficient and timely support from DEFRA. Comments, please. So combining those two, I think from the conversations that we've had in the New Forest and in the Malvern Hills, these comments are actually very just. For the average commoner on the ground, this does sound very complicated, and it requires a huge amount of resource, and we have to be mindful that a lot of commoners on commons associations are there on a voluntary basis. The verderers of the New Forest are there on a voluntary basis. We know that not only are Natural England overstretched, but so too are Forestry England and lots of our national parks and AOMBs. The organisations there are also under financial pressure. I don't know if anyone else wants to chip in on those comments.
Maybe Joe wants to comment on this.
Or Andy? I know we've had conversations about this today.
Yeah, I mean, we've already chatted earlier on today, actually, with the National Park Authority. I find it hard to understand in the amount of preaching we have that people require the open spaces, the recreational side of it. We talk about mental health quite frequently now. The National Park provides that. Now, why cannot the National Park have sufficient funding to develop that for the good of the people? It seems like it's across the board. Every single organisation here within the forest is worrying about money, and we are struggling because of that. The money needs to come in to filter down to people like the commoners, the community, the businesses that take part within the forest. We need that finance.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Andy. We've had another interesting comment on the web chat. Fiona Gover has made the very important point that not all New Forest commoners benefit from the HLS rollover. So the New Forest HLS is the existing HLS is on the Crown land. Unfortunately, the National Trust HLS scheme was not rolled over, and so it does not apply to the New Forest commoners on National Trust commons. So Julia has commented, it's a very good point, and I hope the National Trust New Forest commons will soon go into scheme. It seems like a good opportunity where CS Plus could work well. There are the complexity of commons is the really big issue. We've got time for one more question, I think. Non-active and active graziers is a complicated issue. We have a bunch of non-active graziers as our CS scheme does not allow sheep grazing, just cattle. Their rights apply to sheep only. Could they technically become active graziers if we change to a different scheme and as such add another layer of complexity to our schemes?
I'm happy to answer this if you'd like, Lyndsey.
Yes, please.
I mean, I'm assuming at the moment the non-active graziers are being paid, the ones who have sheep, if you say doesn't allow sheep grazing, so they're being paid not to do sheep grazing because otherwise they could graze their sheep. So they're party to the current scheme. So anybody who has a right of common can exercise their right of common unless they have agreed not to exercise their right of common, which is the point that Josie was making earlier. You need to constrain people's rights, otherwise they have a legal right to exercise it. So yes, anybody can become an active grazier if they haven't agreed not to. And that's really important. So if schemes change, whether you're on, you know, if people aren't signed up to a current scheme and they suddenly decide to exercise their rights, they can do that, which is why it's really important to include non-graziers. But also, if you have a new scheme, depending on the requirements of that scheme, you would need to consult with them and to make sure that they are included. And particularly, you know, over a 10-year period, you know, for the CS agreement, it's important that that's taken into account. So I think the really important thing with legal rights, whether it's an owner, whether it's a tenant or a commoner, is that these are legal rights that people have a right to use. It's not like people are a complete pain because they're exercising their legal rights. They have their legal rights, and we must have a scheme that incorporates everyone's legal rights. Because one commoner, whether you're an active or non-active grazier, your rights are the same. It's just whether you happen to have used them, but legally they are the same. They don't disappear through non-use. And so it's important that we are neutral in it, and in the same way that an owner has rights, and those must be taken into account as well. So that's the transparency and respect for all sorts of for all types of legal rights. It should be the basis for schemes and the basis for governance going forward. And incorporating everybody is critical rather than leaving people out. And that's why these nested schemes of agreements that Josie's been designing for us are really important to take into account. It builds on a lot of academic work. The first woman to get the Nobel Prize for Economics did this round nested schemes for, you know, Commons, Eleanor Ostrom. So, you know, where this isn't just sort of a new proposal that's been dreamt up. I think we're running, well, sorry, we're going into overtime, aren't we, Lyndsey?
Yes, time for our last poll, I think.
Yes.
So if you wouldn't mind adding your answer after everything you've heard tonight, out of the options presented for landscape scale delivery on Commons through Elm, which one do you think would work best or be most desirable for your common? So if you could put in your answer there, that would be really useful for us. A huge thank you to Josie for giving up your evening and for all the work that you've done. Massive thanks to Matt and Andy for contributing your thoughts, and to Joe and Susan for all of the hard work over the past 18 months. This has not been an easy journey, but we've worked through, and I'm really proud of what we've delivered. And yeah, thank you to everyone for listening. Please send us, if you have any further questions, please send them over to us. We're happy to answer, and keep an eye on our social media feeds and on our website, and we will do our best to keep all of those with an interest in common land updated. A couple more minutes for the poll. Julia, have you got any final thoughts?
No, I think I just want to say thank you very much also to all the commoners and owners in the New Forest and the Malverns who've actively worked with us over the last 18 months. One young commoner just passing behind us. It's really important that we have, that we are working collectively on this. And this has just been a tiny little insight this 18 months. Commons have been managed for, over 1,000 years, and they will continue to be managed. They will continue to be central to, our sense of being and place, and people have said appreciation of the countryside. So thank you very much to everyone who's engaged with us, and please, do give us feedback, those who've attended today, and we try our best to get back to you. If we don't, just badger us. I always say to people, if you don't hear back from me, I get a lot of emails, please just send me a WhatsApp or a text, or ring me up, and we're delighted to engage with you. And it really helps us meet the needs of those who manage common land for commoners and owners, and those who assist them as well. So thank you very much. And thanks to DEFRA, I should say, also for their funding for the project as well. We hope we maintain our status as a critical friend.
It's interesting to see the results of the poll, and there's a real mix across the board, actually. The most popular being multiple linked CS schemes, so the CS plus incentives for linking schemes. So we are all looking forward to finding out more about CS plus, because I think for a lot of commons that feels like the most straightforward way forward, but with adding some bespoke options. A lot in favour of a single CS scheme, and others looking for multiple CS schemes. So excellent. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And yeah, good night. Thank you so much.